article has featured today in the Indian Express. This article basically talks about the nearing of tariff talks between India and US. Now US has set out a deadline of 1st of August, after which it will impose a tariff to the tune of 26% on the Indian goods that are being exported. And India is negotiating hard to sign a trade deal with US. Now this week was particularly important because India also signed a historic trade deal with the UK. And India is negotiating some kind of a similar trade deal with that of US also. However, the same article highlights that still the round of negotiations are going on and the trade deal will not be finalized on the 1st of August. It will be finalized around 15th of August and might come into action around the October month. Now, this article also highlighted that there are three things that needs to be kept in mind when we are negotiating the trade deal. The first is that the US is pushing hard for a zero duty access to the India, which it has pushed similarly in the case of Vietnam and Indonesia. Secondly, US is basically pushing on a headline tariff and India does not want that this headline tariff should in any case cross upward of 15% mark. If it goes upward of 15% mark, it will be detrimental for the Indian exporters and it will take a hit on Indian exports. And the third thing that we are basically looking for is basically that a lot of this trade deal will also depend on the external factors. Now already this article also mentions that the trade deal, which has been lumbering for some time now, has impacted the Indian exporters. My name is Ankit Kaul. In this video, we'll try to understand what are the major economic issues between India and US, why in the past has Donald Trump called India as a tariff king, and what are the issues that are coming out of this trade deal that is being negotiated. The first thing that India wants from this trade deal is that anywhere the headline tariff should not go beyond 15% or at the max to the 17 or 18%. Because any further it will go, it will hurt the Indian exports. India is worried about the transshipment clause that the US has put down on Vietnam. Now we'll understand this transshipment clause later. But this is what India wants, to have a trade deal with US, and particularly in the automotive sector, for which US is asking excess and to reduce the tariff, which India has already reduced. Now US wants India to further reduce the tariff. India is basically willing to do so, but only in a phased manner, like we have done it for UK. That is, it will be implemented in a phased manner and gradually. So let us understand where did all this problem start, or what are the economic issues between India and US, particularly regarding the tariffs. Now this is not the first time that Donald Trump has threatened India for the tariffs. When during the previous regime or the previous tenure of Donald Trump called India as tariff king and imposed tariffs on India. Donald Trump in the past has imposed tariffs on India in terms of exports of steel and aluminium to the US. US in the past has also responded by withdrawing the GSTR benefits to India, which took a toll of around $5 billion on the Indian exports. Now this is not the first time what we mean to understand from this. But why is US doing so? US has certain issues. Now one thing we need to understand. Looking from 1990s till today, we can understand one thing. That the India-US trade has increased. It has increased significantly post the India's adoption of LPG reforms. And in the last year, it was close to around $129 or $130 billion. Now this might feel like a great deal, but it is actually not. because when you will see the amount of trade that happens between US and China, which are rivals for each other, it comes to be around close to $600 billion. It is 570, 80 something, close to $600 billion. That is 4 times roughly the Indo-US trade. Now, when you compare it with the trade with respect to even smaller countries like that of Vietnam, the US-Vietnam trade is significantly similar to that of India-Vietnam trade. Is significantly similar to that of US and India trade. So basically there is a parity between the US-Vietnam trade and that of the India-Vietnam trade. And Vietnam, let me remind you, is a much smaller country than that compared to India. So yes, we have made rapid progress since 1990 in terms of trade, but when we compare it to the peers, we find that the Indian and the US trade is lagging behind. Now this brings us to the question that what are the reasons or what are the impediments in India and US trade partnership. India and US face also a problem in what we call as the agricultural sector. In agricultural sector, for example, US has been pushing fast for India to abolish its input subsidies. Input subsidies, some of the example of input subsidies being that of, for example, say that of MSP. US has been critical about the same, and US is pushing that we need to abolish the input subsidies as these are considered as trade distorting. And these input subsidies are very crucial for India to support its farmers, to make farming remunerative, and to ensure food security of India. So we have not abolished the same. Rather, we have negotiated hard at the WTO level. India, on the other hand, highlights that whenever Indian goods are being sent abroad, they face a lot of non-tariff barrier and a lot of phytosanitary measures. A lot of phytosanitary measures are being employed by the US to basically restrict the flow of goods from India to US. So the problems is from both the ends, not only from that of India, but also from US. Secondly, another issue that the US highlights is basically the Indian government decisions and the problems with the Indian Patent Act. For example, the Indian Patent Act allows for 2 things, that is compulsory licensing. First is compulsory licensing, and the second is we restrict evergreening. So these are the 2 things that the Indian patent allow. That is, we can allow for compulsory licensing. When a particular medicine is considered that of importance for the larger public, we can allow that basically these goods can be produced at the generic level also, which basically violates the patent regime, of which the US has been saying that they have invested billions of dollars in research and development. Now India has an obligation towards the health of the citizen, and India allows this only in some crucial circumstances. And that has what has also made India as the king of the pharmacy, or the pharmacy of the world as we call it, as the leading producers of generic medicines. The second problem that they highlight is the issue of evergreening, which we do not allow. Now, what do these pharma producers do? Whenever their patent regime is being expiring, they introduce certain minor changes in the formulations, and they seek to extend this patent for the period of next 20 years. Now, the Indian Patent Act does not allow for the same. And Indian Patent Act restricts this evergreening, which goes again or which drives away the profit of this big pharma industry in US. And this is also a cause of concern for the US. In the recent time, what has other thing happened in the health sector is that there has been a change in the policy of India. For example, India has changed its policy with regard to stents, that is the pharmaceutical products, and that of, for example, say knee and hip replacement, wherein we have now seen that India is becoming a diabetes capital of the world and the instances of heart attacks has been increasing in India. These heart attacks are preventable using the techniques of that of stents. And what did the Indian government do to make sure that the healthcare is affordable and the out-of-pocket expenditure is minimized? That we put a capping on the price of the stents. And this directly went against the capitalist interest of the US medical companies. Similarly, we have also put a cap on the knee and hip replacement surgeries that have been done in India with regard to the replacement that are being ordered from the US. And this basically goes against the interest of the US companies. And this is also a place where we have issues with the US. The next place that we highlight as an issue, or that US faces an issue, is with regard to the changes in the draft and the e-commerce rules, taxes that we have introduced and the e-commerce rules. For example, India in the past has changed its e-commerce rule, and it has brought out certain changes in the rules in the form that none of the big marketplaces like that of Amazon or now the Flipkart, which is now owned by Walmart, has been allowed to basically station their own medium of selling on these platforms. For example, most of you might have ordered the products from Amazon, and you might have seen one seller repetitively on Amazon, which is basically Cloudtail. Now we have basically introduced draft rules to make sure that it does not create a monopoly, and the marketplace model, which basically the Amazon follows, remains open for all the entrepreneurs who are basically willing to sell their products here. This will produce a level playing field, and these rules went against the interest of basically the US tech majors. Similarly, what we have done, we have now been introducing taxes, or what you might have seen in news sometime in the form of data equalization levy. Data equalization levy, which we basically put on the companies that basically shift their profit to the other countries. For example, like that of Google, or which has been regarded as a case by the MNCs as nothing but base erosion and profit shifting activities, which has been exploited by the MNCs in order to basically make their profit goes to the tax haven countries. And this has been basically caught down by many countries, including India, for which India has introduced a data equalization levy. This again goes and the profit of the tech majors of US, including that of Google. And under the new data protection guidelines and the rules that India has introduced, India basically wants that the Indian data should be kept in India only, such that the Indian data cannot be utilized and the Indian people should not be used as products. So these are the changes which has basically impacted the US position. Now US also highlights that Indian government used to put a lot of taxes on particularly the automotive section, wherein they were highlighting the high tariffs which were being put on a popular brand called as that of Harley Davidson, or basically if they can highlight, or you might be knowing about this fact in the form of Ford Mustang. These were one of the few common automotives that were in news. Though India has now significantly reduced the tariffs on these, but the US wants a open or net zero access for them, and this will be problematic for India. Now the next issue that India highlights is that of the visa issue. It is not like that only in US has the issues with us. We also have the issue with US. For example, the visa issue. US in the past has increased the H-1B visa fees. The fees has been increased by US, and this was detrimental for India as most of the H-1B visas were basically given to Indians. This was primarily detrimental for the Indian IT sector. Secondly, during the second tenure of Trump, the visas that are being granted for higher education for the students who are going to US for higher education has substantively reduced. There has been a steadfast increase in the number of rejections coming from the US embassies when they are willing to go abroad and study abroad. Third thing, there is an absence of what we call as a totalization agreement. India has been pushing long for these reforms, a totalization agreement. Now, what does this totalization agreement means? This totalization agreement here is simple. India basically wants to promote this totalization agreement under which a person who has worked for some time in US, suppose say 10 years, now plans to return to India, basically should be given the due share of money that he has contributed. Now the next question that will come into mind, why has Indian person contributed? So the Indian person for the last 10 years might have contributed in the form of social security scheme. Under the social security scheme, an Indian person who is basically living abroad on H1 visa, L1 visa or other type of visas might have contributed to the US in the form of contribution under the social security scheme. This is basically seen as a social security measures. So in case of any mishap scenario, tomorrow the same social security contribution can be used for the treatment of this citizen. Now suppose nothing happens for a period of 10 years when this Indian guy stayed in US. Now he plans to return to India. When he plans to return to India, suppose the contribution that he has made in the last 10 years is suppose say rupees 50 lakhs under the social security scheme. But this money which the Indian person has contributed apart from the taxes will not be given to the Indian person. Rather, this will be kept with the US government also when he decides to come back to India. So India wants a totalization agreement for the people who are splitting their careers between US and India. And this totalization agreement will ensure that at least a due share of money is basically returned back, as it is the Indian citizen who has contributed while he was working in US, and a due share of the same should be given back to the Indian citizen when he plans decides to move back to India. So this is another issue. India also wants that there should be greater access. This has been a steady demand of India, that there should be a greater access. And this demand is also not very wrong, because India has the expertise in mode 2 and mode 4. I hope that you understand what is mode 2 and mode 4 for economics. So India wants the greater access of our professionals to be freely able to access to the US, which the US steadily has been denying. So it is not like that the concerns are only on the part of India, the concerns are also on the part of US, and both countries needs to iron out these issues. Now one last thing that is particularly, and we have to keep a tab on this, this thing will appear in the agreement later which is done between US and India, we'll keep a tab on that. You also keep a tab on that. What is this thing? The first thing is what will be the headline tariff. The first thing that you have to keep in mind is about the headline tariff. The second thing that you have to keep into mind while seeing this agreement is basically the clause of transshipment clause. Transshipment clause. Now this transshipment clause has been imposed on Vietnam. Now you need to understand one thing. Why is US pushing for these reforms or why is US pushing for these trade deals? Because with these countries, US faces a massive trade imbalance. So that is the reason they may face a massive trade imbalance with Vietnam, with Indonesia, with India, with China, etc. So Donald Trump basically, in terms of popular rhetoric, wants to do or undo the things that have gone wrong in the past. So what is this transshipment clause? Vietnam has been imposed with 20% of the transshipment clause tariff. This basically is a technique of US to restrict any form of rerouting, of goods coming from China through Vietnam. Now this is problematic. Okay, we won't be selling the Chinese goods to the US. But this transshipment clause also has a subclause which says that the goods should not be used, or the intermediary goods coming from China should not be used. And let me remind you one fact. India is a major exporter to US, and Indian exports to US offsets the Indian imports from US, meaning thereby the balance of trade is positive for India when we trade with US. But what we export, for example, suppose say the example of medicines. So we export a lot of medicines. When we export a lot of medicine, we are dependent on China for the intermediary goods. We are dependent on China for the intermediary goods. Now, what is this dependence on China in terms of intermediary goods? For the medicines, we need a product which is called as API, active pharmaceutical ingredients. India has been able to achieve the feat of pharmacy of the world because of its ability to produce generic medicine, and India has been able to do so because of the availability of this API, that is the active pharmaceutical ingredients. And 70% of this active pharmaceutical ingredients, approximately 70%, is being imported from China. So the first thing that we'll keep in mind is the headline tariff, and which we want around to be only 15%. But if US comes out with this clause of transshipment clause, which it has imposed on Vietnam and imposes the same on India, then an additional charge of 20% tariff will also be applied on India. So how these things will basically manifest and how these things will be finalized in the treaty or the trade deal that we are likely to do by October is to be seen. You have to keep a tab, and India and US needs to find a way out on these two parameters, on these issues, such that we can increase the partnership between India and US and take it to the next level, because we might have made a lot of progress in terms of trade deal, in terms of trade between India and US from 1990s till today, but still there is a long way to go between India and US and truly match the target of the $500 billion which was set between the US President Donald Trump and the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which they are looking forward to achieve in the coming future. The target of $500 billion, the concept of MAGA and MEGA, can be realized only when we address the economic issues. At the last, you need to understand one thing. In international relations, the relations between the countries will be as strong as there will be the economic partnership. The only exception to this is that of India and China. Also US and China, but US and China are basically there for a hegemonic competition. So there is a competition between US and China for sure, but that is regarding the hegemony, not regarding the economics. Between India and China, we are the only exception wherein, because despite of the complex economic interdependence that we have on each other, despite of that fact, India and China also faces confrontation. Otherwise, the level of diplomatic relationship between the two countries is dependent on the level of economic partnership. And if India and US want to realize this target of $500 billion, there is a need for India to basically, and the US also, to basically structure all the issues that we have discussed. Only after the structuring of all these issues, India and US can take the partnership to the next level. I hope this video has made you understand what you need to keep a tab on and what are the reasons behind India and US regarding the trade deal. Thank you.